Let's talk a little bit about something else we need to consider in software development and design, particularly high availability and high scalability. When we talk about high availability, we can think about it like a 7-Eleven. Think about high availability like the hours a store is open. 7-Eleven is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're not going to see a back in 5 sign on the door. High scalability is different than just being open 24 hours a day. It means there are more shops open all around. So if you come up to 7-Eleven and there's a line out the door, you can go to another one and you can still get your Slurpee. The idea of high availability and high scalability is defined in the contract. In the software world, we call that a service level agreement or an SLA. The thing we forget is that we can change our SLA. For example, 7-Eleven was originally open from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. If you showed up at 11:01, they were not obligated to give you a Slurpee. But that's okay because it was clear what the availability was, so no one had an expectation of a midnight Slurpee run. Now, we defined that contract in a few categories. DevOps usually focuses on the metrics themselves, but before we get to that point, we need to define our business requirements. First, we need to consider things like who will be using the service, what our return on investment is for servicing those people, and then we can decide what it's going to cost in real money, reputation, and possibly legal penalties if we're not providing that service. So with that in mind, we can define the actual rules that drive our uptime metrics. Are we going to promise 3 nines, meaning we're going to be up 99.9% of the time, which is about 9 hours of outage a year? Or are we going to be 4 nines, which means we can only have 53 minutes of outage a year? How quickly do we have to respond if there's an outage? And what counts as a response? Do we send emails? Do we put up notices on the site? And if you do have some sort of a failover experience, what happens to that user? Are they going to lose their session and have to start over? That failover might actually constitute an outage, even though everything else seems to be up and running. Now that we've defined the business requirements and set up all of the technical support for those business requirements, we're able to set up our monitoring. This is the nuts and bolts of operations. You need to set up the monitors and know who and how people are alerted to the outage, what process to escalate to fix it, how to completely rebuild the whole thing in a huge disaster. We're talking our classic disaster recovery. And we have to document who, how, and when the customer gets notified, depending on what had failed. But then this brings us to the concept of what is a failure? Obviously, if you're completely down, that's an outage. But if something is just being slow enough that people can't use it, that could also be an outage. For example, if 300 people show up at 7-Eleven at the same time and there's only one cashier, it's as good as being closed when you're the 250th person in line. Then there's an unexpected user experience. If I walk into 7-Eleven and I expect a Slurpee, but there's only Dairy Queen Blizzards, there's something wrong with the contract. If the software responds with strange things, it may still constitute a failure in your agreement. And finally, a security breach that doesn't affect performance or delivery can still be an outage, especially in our era of GDPR, CPAA, and other privacy laws. These still require identification, escalation, fixing, and notification under the agreement. So how do we define our downtime? We describe it in nines. 1 9 gives you over a month of unplanned downtime in your SLA. Naturally, no one really promises 90% uptime, but if you did, you could be down for up to a couple hours a day. Meanwhile, 9 nines only gives you 31.5 milliseconds a year of outage. So you have really tight requirements on that. Most of the industry is comfortable with 3 nines. This means you have about 10 minutes of downtime a week, and you can still be within your SLA. Now keep in mind, you could define your SLA to include planned outages that aren't included in those nines of uptime. For example, you can state in your agreement that if you give forewarning that you're going to be down for an entire day to do updates, it's okay as long as you notify those customers in advance. I can't stress this enough. The contract defines when you're in trouble. Unless we're talking about a legal breach like a data loss, you can pretty much define your downtime any way you want. So, to review, we want to design an always-on 24/7 experience that scales up as needed. We need to define our service level agreements based on business requirements and measurable metrics that we can actually do something with. Then we have to get our monitoring in place so that we truly understand what's going on in an outage that allows us to tune the right pieces at the right place and understand the user impact and design for a graceful failover, keeping the customer as comfortable as possible, even in a disaster.